group online as well, but we will get started. Welcome to today's special lecture in our Distinguished Lecture Series, and welcome also, for many of you, to the University of Maine. I'm Joan Lundy, the president of the University of Maine, and I also serve as University of Maine System Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation. We're living in a time when clinical practice and research across fields, but today our focus is on the medical field, are being rapidly reshaped by breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and data science. And today we have a special treat and a distinct privilege of exploring these frontiers through the lens, catch that, credit Giovanna with that pun, through the lens of ophthalmology. Our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Michael Chiang, is the director of the National Eye Institute and will be sharing his perspectives on how AI and imaging are transforming care and the broader medical landscape. Joining us for what promises to be a very enlightening discussion is a truly world-class panel, including Alon Harris, professor of ophthalmology and professor of artificial intelligence and human health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, a worldwide leader in ophthalmic AI and vascular research, and our distinguished lecturer from last September. As a learner-centered R1 university with record-high PhD enrollment and research funding, the University of Maine is uniquely positioned to scale our partnership with the NIH and lead the next frontier of health innovation and data-driven discovery. To formally open this event as the main organizer and to introduce the first of our special guests, it is my honor to welcome our Interim Vice President for Research and Dean of the Maine College of Engineering and Computing, Dr. Giovanna Guidoboni. Giovanna is a tireless champion for innovation and research excellence, not only at our university, but across our state, the nation, and internationally. She is a former Fulbright Scholar and an elected member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Please join me in welcoming Giovanna Guidoboni.
Thank you, President Lundy, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. It is an absolute honor for me to open this distinguished lecture and panel discussion that will follow as we explore the cutting edge of medicine and technology. Today, I have the distinctive pleasure of introducing a world-renowned scholar, Professor Alon Harris, whose career embodies the spirit of innovation, entrepreneurship, and care that we champion here at Maine. Actually, Professor Alon Harris has a very strong connection with Maine. He's a faculty in the Graduate School of Biomedical Science and Engineering. He is a current active member of several graduate committees, and he is PI and co-PI on grants with us. And he has visited us in September for his distinguished lecture. So the first time I met Professor Alon Harris, it was in 2010, when I was a recently hired faculty in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, IUPUI. And he was the director of the clinical research at the Bleak Eye Institute at the Indiana University School of Medicine. And I was in a tour in his clinic, and he was showing everything that can be measured non-invasively in the eye. And it's pretty amazing because the eye is made for light to go through, and it is possible to image so many things. And so I asked him, but if you can already see all of this, why do you need us? And he was like, it is not just about what we measure, it is what is the reproducibility, what are the errors, and then what is it that gives rise to what we measure? So how can we understand the mechanisms that give rise to those measurements in the first place? So here we are. At the time, I had no idea how famous it was, and I actually thought that every clinic in ophthalmology had all the toys and instruments that he had. So after 16 years, we're still working together, and his contributions to the field are really staggering. He has published over 419 peer-reviewed articles, 23 books, 72 book chapters. He authored patents on treatment for diseases and diagnostics. He is an entrepreneur, works with companies both in pharma and medtech. And His Excellence has recently been recognized globally with the 2025 Glaucoma Foundation Award for Excellence and Innovation in Glaucoma. And as a key opinion leader, he has lectured in every continent, and so today he will bring a truly global perspective to our discussion. I am also very proud to say that in 2014, we co-founded together the very first international peer-reviewed journal, bringing together AI and ophthalmology. It is published by Goodwill Publication in the Netherlands. And when the Society for Artificial Intelligence in Vision and Ophthalmology was founded in 2025, the journal became the official journal of the Society. So it is a pleasure to have you here. Please join me in welcoming Professor Alon Harris.
Thank you, Giovanna, and President of the University for having me here again, and actually giving me the distinct honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Michael Chiang. I just want to take a couple words about the 2 days that we've had together, Michael. I've learned so much. The discussions spanned from education to science to future of the medical schools, looking at artificial intelligence, philosophy of science, and most importantly, family and children. So it was a great pleasure. I also want to congratulate the University of Maine. The facilities are just really amazing, breathtaking. I was here on a tour with Giovanna before, but discovered that there was a lot more, and I can't think about what's going to happen in my next visit. So, as I was telling Giovanna, I think, when we were walking back through one of the sessions that we've seen so much, I said, you know, this place really makes me motivated or thinking about wanting to become younger, come back here, and get a triple major in essentially in engineering, you know, and artificial intelligence, as well as in computational science and maybe medical sciences to come as well. So it really, the level of people that we met, the research interest was thought-provoking. Thank you. So it's really a profound pleasure and professional honor to introduce today's distinguished lecturer, who is a visionary leader and bridges, in my opinion, the worlds of medicine, engineering, artificial intelligence, and data science. And I can think of no one better to deliver this talk, who has actually had substantial contributions and experience in all of those. Dr. Michael Chiang has been serving as the director of the National Eye Institute at the NIH since 2020. His career is a masterclass in interdisciplinary excellence, beginning with engineering and biology degrees from Stanford, and therefore so suitable for delivering this talk here today. He is one of those unique physician scientists who actually understands engineering and basic science. A master in biomedical informatics from Columbia and an MD from Harvard Medical School and the Harvard MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology. Doesn't get much better than that as far as one's background education. What makes Dr. Chiang, in my opinion, very unique in his multifaceted expertise is that he's board certified in ophthalmology, but also in clinical informatics. That's a very unique combination. This rare perspective has allowed him to lead the charge in how we use artificial intelligence and electronic health records to improve patient outcomes. So Dr. Chiang's impact in the field is really difficult to overstate. He has published over 300 peer-reviewed papers. His research group developed an assistive AI system for ROP, or retinopathy of prematurity, that received breakthrough status from the US Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Chiang is an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine and is a key advisor to the US Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy. Before his appointment to the NIH, Michael held prestigious professorships at Columbia University, was a close neighbor, but then he decided to leave, as well as in Oregon Health and Science University, where he served as the Associate Director of the KCI Institute. Beyond his title, he has been a tireless leader for the American Academy of Ophthalmology, with one example being Michael chairing the committees on artificial intelligence and data analytics. Michael is a world-class physician scientist and a pioneer in shaping the very future of how we see and treat disease in the digital age. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Chiang for his keynote lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And Giovanna, President Free Monday, thank you very much for the invitation to come here and visit. I've now been in Maine for about 23 and a half hours. And it has been awesome. I've loved getting to see what I'd say is that puritanical history and hardworking sort of culture together with what looks like a spirit of teamwork. Yesterday we were in an Institute of Medicine meeting with Daniel Harder, and people were talking about working together to make Maine better. And I love that spirit. And also just with that forward-looking, we visited several buildings, the GM building, and it's, wow, this is really happening here. And so all those together. So it's been a real privilege. Like, one of the things about my job is that I love getting to see places around the country where there's so much amazing work that's going on. So what I've been asked to talk about is some of what we're doing at the National Eye Institute. And I titled this AI and Data Science and Medical Care, tied into the NEI, because as Dr. Harris said, that's some of where I came from academically, and I know that Giovanna is the Dean of the School of Engineering. And so we thought that we would talk about some of the work that I once did, and then how it informs the work that's happening now at the National Eye Institute and the NIH more broadly. Okay, so we'll try to do that, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion after this. Now, I know that this is an audience that comes from a broad range of backgrounds, and so I wanted to start with this: what's the National Eye Institute? Okay, so at the National Institutes of Health, which is our county organization in Bethesda, Maryland, there are 20-some institutes: the National Cancer Institute, National Institute of Mental Health, and the NEI is one of those institutes. Okay, we were founded in 1968 by Congress, and then President Lyndon Johnson as the branch that managed national efforts in vision science. Okay, so what we do is we direct vision research and we fund vision research. Our budget this year is $896 million, and that makes us the largest funder of vision research anywhere in the world. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is in terms of the work, the impact that we have on clinical care. Okay, we've funded almost every major advance in eye care that's occurred over the past few decades. But this is a group I really want to talk about, though, the impact on science. One thing that I'm especially proud of is that we have funded the work of 8 Nobel Prize winners. And I'm trying to get this cursor to show up, but it's all right. We funded the work of 8 Nobel Prize winners. And the reason that I think that's interesting is that there's a lot of seminal innovations that occurred first in the eye because it's so accessible. And that makes it a really good target for methodological innovation that then gets generalized to other parts of the body and other areas of science. Okay, so I'll come back and talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so I wanted to motivate why we're talking about what we're talking about, AI, data science, with what are the problems in clinical care right now. Okay, so one of the diseases that I started studying as a junior faculty member at Columbia University was a disease called retinopathy of prematurity. It causes babies to go blind. And the way you diagnose ROP and how do you know a baby is going to go blind and needs to be treated is that you look and see, are their blood vessels tortuous? In other words, are they wiggly? And are they dilated? Okay, if they are, you need to treat the baby. The baby's going to go blind. If they're not, you can watch the baby. Okay, so that seems obvious, and there have been clinical trials done to prove that that's the way you diagnose it. But about 20 years ago, we did what I thought was an embarrassingly basic study, where we took images of retinas from babies and showed them to experts around the world and asked, is it plus disease, meaning bad, or is it not plus disease, meaning normal? And here's one image, and there's a little bit of tortuosity and a little bit of dilation, and 50% of people call this plus disease, and 50% call it not plus disease. And so if this is the thing that separates out bad versus not bad, why do the world experts split 50-50? And we had a lot of images that split 60-40, 70-30, and intuitively, this, you think this is not good. And in fact, if you get a lot of different experts here, this is 8 world experts looking at 100 different images, a lot of interesting stuff comes out. Okay, so the way to read this is that every expert reads every image, and if they called it plus, meaning severe, potentially blinding, the box is in red. Okay, if they interpret that image as being normal, the box is in green. And there's an intermediate category called pre-plus. Basically, you have borderline disease, that's yellow. Okay, so they score basically red, yellow, or green. And the thing to notice here is that experts numbers 7 and 8 down the bottom diagnose severe disease 6 times more often than expert number 1. Okay. And every doctor knows this, that there are some of our colleagues that are aggressive, okay, they're overcallers, and there are some that are conservative, undercallers. And over the years, people have looked at this data and they've said, well, you've got the wrong 8 experts. About 7 years ago, we put together, there's a committee every 15 or so years that meets to come up with international standards for how you diagnose this disease. We got all those experts together. I happened to chair the panel. We reran this experiment with the 30 experts who defined the disease for the rest of the world. It was that exact 6-to-1 ratio. Okay, so this is what that discrepancy looks like among experts on a grid here. And this is how AI can help doctors make diagnoses that are more accurate and more consistent. Okay, so that's the why. Now, what we're doing at the National Eye Institute, about a year after I started, we put together a strategic plan. And just to give a quick overview of this, we organized that strategic plan around 7 what we call cross-cutting areas of emphasis. These bars here, genetics, neuroscience, immunology, regenerative medicine, data science, quality of life, and population health. And the reason that we chose those 7 areas is that basic science departments are organized by methodology. Okay, there's genetics, neuroscience, immunology, and our portfolio at the National Eye Institute, like all different clinical groups, is organized by disease. We've got a retina portfolio, cornea, glaucoma, optic neuropathy. These are all different parts of the eye. And every medical school is organized in departments that are based on the different parts of the body. And so we thought this was the best way to show that we get collaborations when we intersect methodologies together with different body parts and diseases. Okay, so we're trying to foster collaborations. Okay, so I'm going to mostly focus on data science and AI here, because that's the title of the talk. But just from people that I met over the past 23 and a half hours, I wanted to add a couple slides just because I think they'll speak to what some of the people here are interested in. And one of the methodological innovations, maybe I'll just back up here. The reason that I'm really interested in pushing this concept of methodological innovation, and the reason that I think it's interesting here is that this is a university where most of the people, we don't have a medical school here in Maine, at least not yet. But there's a lot of methodological expertise. Okay? And so we're always looking for how do you apply methodological expertise together. How do you apply methodological innovation to different parts of the body and different diseases? Okay, so And I happen to think the eye is a good place to do that because it's transparent, it's accessible. There are two eyes. If you do something with one eye, you've got to build in control. You can image it, really, really easy. I'll come back and talk more about that. There are other parts of the body that are good, obviously, for this. But the application here is that for people who are blind, in other words, completely blind, building retinal prosthetics, retinal chips, basically. And so this happens to be work from Daniel Palanker, who's at Stanford, together with Jose Elaine Sahel, who's at the University of Pittsburgh. And what happens here is that you've got a visually impaired patient. They wear a pair of glasses. That glasses has a camera built in that captures the scene. Okay. And then that glasses, that sends data to a pocket computer that the patient carries, and that computer basically processes the image to characterize all the key information from that image. And then sends data through these near-infrared light pulses to an implant within the retina of the eye that then stimulates the cells to help you see. And they've gotten remarkable advances from that. Now, but the point that I really want to make from that is that if you really look into what it took to build this device, there were advances in semiconductor physics, in wearable electronics, in neural engineering, in visual psychophysics. In other words, there were PhD students in Pittsburgh and Palo Alto and Los Angeles who were writing theses, and junior faculty who were getting tenure for the science and engineering that went into this device. And so I love things like this as examples of how do you marry methodological innovation together with medical care. Because I think that the best faculty are going to want to do innovative work, not take so-called off-the-shelf type work. Okay, so that's the starting point of what I'm hoping to do is create a nidus for marrying methodological innovation together with application, in the eye or elsewhere in the body. So another example of innovation I wanted to show, and this is one of those non-data science examples, but is genetics and regenerative medicine. Okay, so 2001 is about when I started my career, after you go through all this training. And I diagnosed a baby who had a disease called Leber congenital amaurosis. And this is a congenital retinal degeneration where babies within the first few months to years of their lives quickly become blind because the retina degenerates. And at the time, we have to tell this family there's basically nothing we can do to treat your baby. And in 2017, though, the first FDA-approved gene therapy for an inherited disease in any part of the body was for exactly this disease and this mutation. Leber congenital amaurosis with this particular gene that was mutated. And so you can inject drug under the retina and restore that gene. And the video here shows an example of that. On the left side, these patients can't read eye charts because their vision is so low. So we use mobility mazes to quantify their vision. On the left side is before gene therapy. On the right side is after gene therapy. And you see that before, our patient can barely get through. She's really slow and tentative, and stumbles over the obstacles here. And afterwards, she's able to navigate it really, really fluently. Okay. And back in 2001, this would have been complete science fiction. Okay, but it turns out that because in this case it happens to be the eye that was so accessible, you can deliver this drug literally within microns of where you want it to go. And there aren't a whole lot of systemic complications when you inject things into the eye, and so we can pilot things like that. And it turns out that since then there have been 11 FDA-approved gene therapies for all these other diseases, spinal muscular atrophy, sickle cell, and I'm really proud this was the first one. And I love that in places like the Jackson labs, they're doing all this work involving CRISPR-based gene editing. And I think there's a lot of potential for collaborative work in those areas. One of the really hot topics that's coming out of NIH and FDA right now is new approach methodologies, or NAMs. And so what's a NAM? It's an emerging technology that can reduce animal testing. Okay, so these are human-based models, and they can be organoids, so-called organs in a dish, stem cell-based systems, digital twins, basically any sort of in chemical or in silico approach that mimics human tissue. Okay, and so why would we want to do that? Because it would help discovery, testing, creating new therapies. Okay, so this has become, pretty aggressively promoted, within NIH and within the FDA. And, I put down here that one thing that excites me, of course, in the eye is that there's been so much innovation within NAMs. Retinal organoids were one of the first organoids that were ever developed, these retinas in a dish model from a group in Japan. And I specifically wanted to call out a person who's within our NEI program, Kapil Bharti, because he developed, one of these first-in-human stem cell therapies for macular degeneration. Okay, dry macular degeneration, there's really not a very good treatment for it. The retina, thins away, within the center, so you lose central vision. And what they've done in the Bharti group is take a patient's blood, isolate their own induced pluripotent stem cells, okay, use them to differentiate back into retinal pigment epithelial cells, and then grow those retinal pigment epithelial cells onto biodegradable scaffolds, and then transplant them under the retinas of people with dry AMD. And first done in animal models, and now first in human type models, and really, really remarkable stuff. And the reason that I point that out, not only is to talk about the work in terms of NAMs, but also to point out that Kapil has had a long-standing collaboration with the New York Stem Cell Foundation. And he's actually how I learned that Jackson Labs had purchased the New York Stem Cell Foundation. And they do some remarkable work in terms of, in our little piece of the world, retinal pigment epithelial progenitor cells, or creating induced pluripotent stem cell lines. Okay, so I think that's something that's really remarkable in terms of potential for collaboration, and so many other things that we could talk about here. Okay, so with that, let me get over to imaging. So this is some of the stuff that I really wanted to focus on. Quantitative imaging is another, what I'd say, really remarkable methodology. Okay, and so back when I was learning about ophthalmology, okay, I finished in 2001 with all my clinical training. The way that eye doctors examine the eye is that you took lights and lenses and you looked at the eye, and you used words and drawings to describe what you saw. Okay, qualitative, descriptive, but that's classic eye care. Okay, and now that's completely different. 25, 30 years ago, these technologies, the optical coherence tomography imaging, were developed, where here's an image, here's histology of the eye. Okay, take the eyeball out, cut it out, slice it into pieces, look at it in a microscope, and we're basically getting near histological level quality within seconds, completely non-invasively. Okay, and because of that, we can visualize things like nerves, blood flow, neurovascular coupling, in a way that you really can't do in a whole lot of organs. You don't even need to dilate, again, to be able to do that. And so things like that have transformed eye care from being subjective and qualitative to objective and quantitative. Okay, these methodologies have been applied to other diseases. And 2.5 years ago, David Huang, Jim Fujimoto, and Eric Swanson got the Lasker Award, basically the American Nobel Prize, for developing that imaging technology. And really amazing innovation. And when you take images and match them up with clinical data, that's the substrate for all these advances in AI. And that's what I want to lead to here. There's been enormous innovation in AI within the vision space. The first FDA-approved autonomous AI system in any field of medicine was for diabetic eye disease screening, and that was done by a guy, Michael Abramoff, at the University of Iowa. And they started a company that basically does diabetes screening, often for people who live in the rural Midwest. And I couldn't resist. I captured this tweet from Eric Topol about 6 years ago. Of all the medical specialties, most people think radiology is leading the AI movement, but it's actually ophthalmology. Okay, because there's so much image data together with clinical data. And so that, of course, I'm excited about. But one thing I've gotten a little bit more excited about recently is this a field that's now being called oculomics. Okay, so what's oculomics? It's taking images from the eye, usually of the retina, OCT images like this sort that we showed before, and developing AI models to diagnose and predict systemic disease. So heart disease, neurological disease, psychiatric disease, even diseases you wouldn't expect would be linked to the eye. presumably because there's data about nerves, blood vessels, and all those different pieces you can visualize with a whole lot of resolution. There was one group from the UK that published data showing that they could predict whether a patient is going to get Parkinson's disease from a retinal image on average 7 years before it was diagnosed by a neurologist. Okay? And if that's really true and generalizable, then that's remarkable. And this screen capture here is from the American College of Cardiology. So in 2026, if you see a primary care doctor, this is the way that they capture what your cardiac risk is. Okay, should you take statins? So literally every 10 minutes in every primary care office, this is being used. And what goes into this is really high-level stuff. Do you have high blood pressure? Do you have diabetes? And there are groups around the country that believe that if you take retinal images, they can outperform these state-of-the-art 2026 stuff. And so I think that's really exciting to think about, the eye as the window to the rest of the body. And so just about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, we put together an NIH Common Fund initiative called Oculomics. It was a $14 million project where we got people to try to solicit projects, build imaging devices, couple them with AI technologies, and try to diagnose and predict systemic disease. Okay, so really excited about where that leads. Okay, so this is all the promise of AI, but I'm going to argue that there's a lot of challenges. And one of them, so I'm going to talk about these challenges and what we're trying to do to address those challenges. One of them is that we need large data sets to do AI. Okay, this is probably obvious. So around when I started, we became involved at the Institute, helping to lead a Common Fund project at the NIH called Bridge to AI. Okay, and the way these Common Fund projects work is that this is not within our budget. This is a $130 million project over 4 years. Okay, that's not our NEI budget, but it's the NIH Common budget. And those projects are selected because they're meant to be NIH-wide, cross-cutting, innovative, and high impact. And they get selected by votes of different NIH leadership. Okay, so this is one that got picked about 5 years ago. And the purpose of Bridge AI Stage 1 is to generate large flagship multimodal data sets that can then be used for knowledge discovery. Okay, so I know many of you know NIH very well. It's hypothesis-driven research. But this is $130 million for building data sets and hypothesis-generating work. And so it's a really different paradigm for us. And one of the things I was excited about is that of the 4 groups that got funded using this $130 million, one of them is led by a team of ophthalmologists. Okay, so Aaron Lee and Cecilia Lee now at WashU in St. Louis. And their goal is to recruit 4,000 people with diabetes, all these different stages of diabetes, and capture every single type of data from them. Okay, systemic data, medical data, electronic health record data, survey data, eye image data, whole genome sequencing, survey, and make them publicly available. Okay, so people can use it for knowledge discovery. So right now, there's about 4 terabytes of data from about half of their cohort that's been recruited that you can go to this website if you're interested in and look it up. And there are so many different, and we're really hoping to rely on the creativity of the community to try to ask and answer questions. One of the questions we wondered is, can we use data like this to understand pathogenesis? In other words, how do you go from health to sickness? As well as salutogenesis, how do you go from sickness to health? Okay, and so that, I think, was a super important. What's the impact of lifestyle, exercise, healthy living? And so anyway, there are so many questions, I think, that could be answered with this. And just one other thing, that Stage 2, we recently got approved from the NIH Council of Councils, proposed to be $90 million over 5 years to do stuff with this data. Okay, but that's what's coming up down the pipeline. One of the other things that we've gotten interested in is multimodal AI. So a couple of years ago, we were actually the ones that proposed this project called Primed AI. It's another Common Fund project. So it got approved about a year ago, $121 million over 5 years, imaging and multimodal AI for precision medicine. Okay, so we're one of the 5 leads for this, but this is an NIH-wide project. And so it's basically, this doesn't, the notices of funding aren't out yet, but they should be out relatively soon. But the components of this are basically, we want to create projects to integrate imaging data together with other multimodal data. And these could be electronic health record data, genetic data, any other sort of environmental data. Another part of that is build the actual AI algorithms and tools to do things like diagnose, manage, and predict disease. And then we want to get into the real world, okay, clinical practice, get into electronic health records, and into the point of actual delivery of care. Okay, so if you're interested in things like that, stay tuned. Because, we're really trying to push this collaborative, research and also academic industry partnerships. So one thing that I really want to talk about here is another challenge, which is, I think, data sharing in team science. And I love that this came up so many times over the past, when we were at dinner last night, talking about this. So we all see this paradigm all the time, where there are multiple small studies going on around the university, state, country, whatever, basically trying to answer essentially the same question, but are individually underpowered to really be able to answer those questions and to advance the field. Okay, so I do think that we're losing a lot of opportunities to be able to move the field forward. And you could say, well, the other way to say that is that most groups in the real world don't have $130 million to build large flagship data sets. And so in reality, people would be intuitively best served by sharing data and creating from smaller to larger. Right? And at the NIH, as of about 3 years ago, we have a data sharing policy where we talk about there's carrots and there's sticks. And the NIH data sharing policy is a stick, because you have to come up with a plan to share your data, otherwise we won't fund your research. Okay, so that's out there. The problem is that over about 3 years, I've heard literally every single complaint about the NIH data sharing requirement out there. And to me, the way I interpret hours and hours of complaints is that academic success is defined based on individual metrics. Okay, how many papers have you published as senior author or first author? How many grant dollars have you brought in as PI, or what's your H index? And so I'm concerned that people feel like they're being disincentivized to work with each other based on the academic model that we have. And at the end of the day, what I'm really concerned about is that people are sharing poor data as a check-the-box exercise to get NIH funding, because I think our whole community loses when that happens. And this comes back to Israeli industrialist, well-known sort of father of a lot of these business practices. Eliyahu Goldratt. Tell me how you'll measure me, and I'll tell you how I will behave. Okay? And that's something I think every high achiever intuitively figures out. And so to me, the challenge we've gotten more and more interested in. We talk about 21st century team science, and this is how things are done now. And we want to generate a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. And I've really gotten concerned. How do we better actually achieve what we're all talking about? And so gotten more and more interested in. I think we need to create incentives for researchers to feel like they benefit from team science and doing data sharing. Because that's, I believe, how we're really going to shift that culture. In other words, creating carrots to go along with those sticks. Okay, so along those lines, a couple years ago, we created a so-called NIH Data Sharing Challenge, or what we're calling an S-Index Challenge. And the goal of this is to create a robust metric to reward people who share data that's useful to other people. So the more you share, the higher your S-Index goes. And it's $1 million competition to calculate the best metric. And so we were the ones that are leading it, but we've got about 15 different partners from most of the major NIH institutes. And about 6 months ago, we identified 7 there were some great submissions. And so we picked 7 phase 1 finalists. And over the summer, there's going to be a bake-off where we come up with, basically how do we choose a couple that we can really promote. And, I would love to be able to get this into, for example, Google Scholar or Elsevier tools, different things where people can really identify and compete for having the highest metric. And what the other thing that, of course, we're thinking about is what are the other things that characterize 21st century team science? and how can we identify them and eventually find ways to measure them. And if you have thoughts about this, because I know that team science to me seems very baked into the culture here, and please sort of let me know about that. We talk about that in discussion or send me an email. Okay, so really interested in this. Team science and how to promote team science. Now, one thing that's become very hot at NIH is reproducibility and rigor. And Jay Bhattacharya, who's the NIH director, has really been pushing this. Okay? And so why should we care about reproducibility? Well, I think in the box here, I think the goal of every scientist is we want to make discoveries that are robust and generalizable. Okay, they don't just work in my lab. Okay, they work in other labs and other settings. And one of the challenges to that, actually there are many challenges, but one of them is, again, goes back to that academic culture. Academic culture favors individual papers, and it favors novelty, not reproducing what someone else does, and it favors positive results, not negative results, and proving something else didn't work. And there are many differences among fields. If you're doing a bench science type protocol, there's many reasons why. We've all seen this, where the first year grad students can't do what the fourth year postdoc is able to do because the words, the way the postdoc does that, we mix the cells a certain way, and the first year didn't know that because the protocol didn't say that. As an informatics person, I see all the time where different people can analyze the exact same data set to answer the same questions in different ways and come up with different answers, or occasionally the opposite answer from that. And so a lot of reasons for failure to reproduce. And I really hope that there's going to be ways that replication can promote innovation. Okay? Because to the extent that we can show that methods are robust, the analysis pipelines are robust, that's going to be give you a more solid basis for doing, how do you know what deserves to go into more research, or what can be translated in a bench to bedside kind of way. Okay? So hopefully, hopefully reproducibility and innovation go hand in hand to advance the field. Okay, so that's something that we're really interested in at the NIH, and you'll hear more about this in terms of initiatives to promote this. And I just wanted to call out that literally in this week's Nature, the cover is about reproducibility, and there were 4 articles that talk about failure of reproducibility in this case in social and behavioral science research. Okay, so stay tuned about this. Okay. So I want to at this point talk about building real-world data networks, because that's clearly another part of collaboration and team science. Okay, so 2 types of data networks. There's centralized and there's federated or distributed. And we do a ton of centralized, and we're doing more and more federated. But I just want to take you through these centralized data sets. Okay, we have a lot of these at NIH where everybody around the country sends their data to the central hub, right? And there's a lot of benefits of this, because when you aggregate data and analyze it at a central point, it's very simple in a way. The disadvantages, though, are that if, number one, these can be very large files, okay, for the way that data are generated in the 21st century. And the other thing is that if they're health data, you need extensive data privacy, security agreements to send health data from site to site. And these data use agreements can take years or sometimes forever to really get worked out by the lawyers. Now, federated networks have become an alternative to that I've gotten really excited by, where the way that these work is that your data stay locally. Okay, and what you do is you analyze those data locally, and what you share are the results of those analyses. Okay, and so the benefit here is that because you're not sending, for example, health data from site to site, you don't need those data use agreements, and these networks can scale really rapidly. Now, the disadvantage is that because you're analyzing in parallel, it's really crucial to harmonize those data so that you're comparing apples and apples. Okay? And the next slide here talks about the fact that we don't have a harmonized world in terms of scientific data or health data. In scientific data, we've all seen different machines. They don't necessarily talk to each other. Version 2 doesn't talk to version 1. In health data, different electronic health record systems don't talk to each other, even if they're made by the same company sometimes. Or different doctors code things in a way that's inconsistent. And so one thing that we've gotten really interested in is working with the American Academy of Ophthalmology to build a common data model for eye care. And so what that does is it helps helps us map. Okay, you've got all these different apples and oranges. It maps them to a common integrated data ecosystem. And if you've got that, in principle, you can create those standardized cohorts and phenotypes and do that federated analysis that's on the previous slide. Okay, so we've gotten really interested in building a national sort of, vision network that includes eye data, image data, and systemic data, and that'd be really, really powerful. And the question here is, does that actually work? And there's a group called the Odyssey Network that manages this common data model, the so-called OMOP common data model that's used nationally. And about 2 years ago, they had a challenge competition where they solicited projects. And one of the winners of that was an ophthalmologist at Johns Hopkins, Cindy Kai. And her project was relatively simple. If you get a eye drug, if you're using that drug, what's the impact on kidney failure? And does it depend on what specific drug type you use? And so the point that I want to make from this is that what Cindy did is that she took 12 data sets, and each of them had been mapped to that common data model. And within 9 weeks, because of that mapping, she was able to screen 485 million patients and identify 6 million who met inclusion criteria and do that analysis. Okay, no data left any of those centers, and 9 weeks from beginning to end. And there were a few projects like that that I would consider proof of concepts for federated research. And based on that, we created a $1 million challenge to expand, to basically build and expand out a national federated research network for eye care. And we have to announce 4 winners to build different pieces of that network. And so I'm really, really, really excited about that. Okay. So let me move on. One of the other innovations I want to talk about is electronic documentation. And in some ways this is an innovation, in some ways it's not an innovation. But I'll tell you where I'm going with that. So back in the quote old days, we talked about things like the physician-patient relationship. And we've got these Norman Rockwell type images where this concept of the laying on of hands and that personal interaction between patient and doctor was really, really important, right? And what every medical student is told is that you have to interview a patient, learn about them, and you tell a story about them, put that together. Okay, and so back in the old days, this happens that this was a note that I once wrote as a medical student, where you talk to the patient and you write down that whole narrative history about what happened. Okay. And it happens that sometimes eye doctors will use drawings to reflect what they saw that day. Okay, so this is not that long ago, 15, 20 years ago, this is how all medicine was practiced. And now we've moved to electronic documentation, electronic health records, more or less everywhere in the country. Where as we've gone from paper to electronic documentation, these notes have gotten longer and longer. Okay, 5, 6 years ago, I worked with a postdoc, Adam Rule, in Oregon, who's now a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin, who did some analysis on like 40 million some records in Oregon, where I was at the time, and showed that eye notes electronically were 6 pages on average. And these used to be one piece of paper, when people would sketch down the key findings. And they're heavily redundant. In other words, 75% of this note was copied word for word from the previous note. Okay, and how come they're so redundant? Because there are macros that people can pull in to pre-populate certain things, and there are features where you can copy-paste my last month's visit together into my current visit. And it turns out that another person, Jimmy Chen, who's now a fellow at Harvard, was a medical student in Oregon, showed that when they did audit log analysis, only 3% of notes anyone ever actually looks at. And so that raised a lot of questions. The engineers talk about garbage in, garbage out. And if data are really going to be the substrate for AI, how do we make sure that we've got good, good data? And of course, that raises other questions. What's the role of speech recognition and generative AI in clinical documentation? So many, many questions here. So I think that one of my questions is always, okay, what should the future of medical care look like? And I put these images up here because this image on the left is a medical contact lens. It's a retinal contact lens. And when I was a trainee finishing in 2001, you put this up to somebody's eye and you shine lights through it, and then you look at all the nuances of the optic nerve and the retina. And when you do this with thousands of patients, okay, I always thought that was my added value as a physician, that I could see things like that nobody could see. We didn't know how to do this. Okay. The problem is that nobody does this anymore. Okay, any eye doctor who's less than the age of about 45, they don't even know how to do this. Okay, because they don't need to, because there are machines. There are machines that can generate images like this. Okay, that lets you see detail that you can't with that contact lens. Okay, and machines generate data, pictures, and numbers. Okay, and so one thing that I've always been wondering about for a while is that if my added value used to be that I could see all those things, that nobody else could see, these days everybody sees the same numbers. Okay, you can be a super subspecialized cardiologist versus an internist, versus a nurse practitioner versus a patient in rural Maine using Google search. They all see the same numbers. Okay, what is my added value as a subspecialist? And I'm surprised by how many doctors really haven't thought about that. We're going from qualitative to quantitative, regardless of if it's imaging, AI, evidence-based practice, and there's all these paradigm shifts. And what's the role of medicine and clinicians going to look like in the future as you combine with technologies like this? Okay, I think those are really important questions. I would argue that doctors do two things, broadly speaking. We diagnose, okay, meaning what's wrong with you, okay? And that's very objective in a way. AIs are pretty good at that right now, and that they're getting better. And number two, we manage. If you have, and that's a different story. If you have cancer and it's metastatic cancer, do we A, put you in hospice and you can spend quality time with your friends and family, or B, do aggressive chemotherapy? On average, your life expectancy will be 9 months longer, but your quality of life won't be as good. And different people will choose different things in those settings. And I would argue those are human things that people have to communicate. And understand what are your patient's priorities. And so I think it's going to be really, really important, that we're going to have to, as we teach doctors in the future, understand, okay, what do these technologies do? And Kurt Langlofs is a radiologist at Stanford, a real thought leader in this area. And he once gave a quote that AI is not going to replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't use AI. Okay? And I think that's thought-provoking in a lot of ways. And I also think that it's going to be really important to understand what these technologies don't do, and how to cultivate those skills as a unique added value. And just as an example, if one of those things that technologies don't do is talk to patients and understand what their concerns are, I would argue that this younger generation in some ways is not as good as the older generation. My kids text instead of talk. And ironically, I think we may be losing some of those skills, because of these technologies. Okay, so I think that's worth thinking about. In terms of medical education, I would argue the one tool that's used by every single doctor in this country is not a stethoscope. Not even every eye doctor uses an ophthalmoscope. Okay, but every single doctor uses a computer. Okay, and despite that, there is no systematic training in how to use, how to think about AI, electronic health records, any of these types of things. And compare that to how do you do a physical exam? How do you listen to the heart? I mean, doctors will spend months to years of dedicated time learning how to do that. But for the one thing that every single person does, we learn it by trial and error. And the other thing is that medicine is based on an apprenticeship type model, where the person with less gray hair models the behavior of the person with more gray hair. Okay. And where I'm headed with this is that when it comes to technology, AI, electronic health records, it's often the person with more gray hair who knows less, because they didn't grow up doing it. And how are we going to flip that paradigm upside down? Okay, so I think there are a lot of challenges here. And I'm going to finish up here. This is almost my last slide. I think one of our challenges is how do we come up with models to deploy healthcare at large scale? And the traditional model is, and I especially wanted to talk about this because we're in a heavily rural state right now. And the traditional model is that I'm a doctor, my patient will come in and see me. And when I was in Oregon, patients would drive 6 hours, for that 15-minute visit. And these days, with these technologies, it's going to give us opportunities to re-envision what that could look like. Could this care be done at CVS, in the patient's home? And in fact, what would that care consist of? Would it be giving advice to the doctor through AI? Would it be remote screening or remote referral? Would it be some sort of remote management? How are you doing and how are we tracking your disease at home? And we're seeing some of this already happening. But how do we do it at a large scale? And the other thing is that the people who build these devices are going to want to get FDA approval to be able to sell those devices. And the doctors who use those devices are going to want to know that they work and that they can get paid for using them. And that's managed by CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And the economists and the people who pay for this healthcare are going to want to know, are they actually cost effective compared to the alternative? And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities, especially in rural parts of the country like this, to come up with projects that merge those areas, building technologies, figuring out where they're going to go, and figuring out how they can get paid for in a cost-effective way, because there are enormous gaps in that right now. Okay, so last set of things before I stop here is that about 20 years ago, I worked with somebody in Colombia named Vimla Patel. Okay, she was a cognitive psychologist who became an informatician. And she was really interested in this concept of how does technology impact the way people think. Okay, and I wanted to put these up here because I felt that this was a very thought-provoking set of studies. So a three-part study. Okay, so this was done in the late 90s, early 2000s in Canada. And so part one of the experiment is that Vimla Patel, so a traditional paper-based chart. It's a primary care clinic. And so she gives the doctor a piece of paper and says, work up a patient and write me a note. Okay, and so this is what that looked like. Okay, 74-year-old woman, diagnosis in February, polyuria, nocturia, she had an eye exam. At the end, Dr. K seemed pleased with the results. Okay, so this is what every single medical student learns, that you have to talk to a patient and tell a story. Okay, this is narrative text. So part two of the experiment is that practice converts to electronic health records. And this was that electronic health record system in the late 90s. So there's that place where you type, pull downs, drawing template. It actually looks like the EHRs now. And so part two is now you're using a computer, work up a patient and write me a computer note using the EHR. And so that's what the note would look like. Okay. And so this, I know that most of you are not physicians. This is the world that we live in right now. It's not narrative text as much as it is structured documentation. Okay, pull down, so you had pain. Was it sharp, dull, severe, pain mild? And check boxes and pull downs for everything. Okay, so total different paradigm shift. Right? Now, part three of the experiment is that doctor gets used to using EHR. Vimla Patel goes back, gives him a piece of paper, and says, pretend it was back in the old days, work up a patient and write me a note on that piece of paper. And here's what that note looked like on a piece of paper. And this fascinated me, that it's not just, okay, the copy-pasting text and the 6 pages instead of 1 page, but that in some ways, this is a structured note on a piece of paper. That the tools we give for people to do the work can affect the way that they organize information and potentially even the way that they process information. Okay, so I think that's something that's important to think about. For all of you who are doing methodologies that can one day be applied to taking care of people. Okay, so very last time, we've talked about a lot of stuff here. AI, imaging, data science, what we're doing at the NEI and the NIH, things that we need. Big data, data sharing, team science, harmonization, to take advantage of those new technologies. We've talked about challenges in what I'd call the science, technology, and the art of medicine. Okay, the impact of technology on cognition, and the importance of driving culture change in the scientific process. Okay, change management, carrots and sticks, and NAMs, human-based models, and reproducibility. And lastly, I think that in terms of what's happening here, what I've seen in the past now 24 hours is opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration, okay, connecting dots in terms of different areas of excellence. I love these concepts of these new building designs, okay, coming up and bringing people together. And that meeting that I sat in, at those multiple meetings that I sat in on yesterday, rural medicine and novel care delivery methods and novel educational models that combine different institutions around the states, and the potential for things like technological leapfrogging, that maybe you're not going to be constrained, okay, by all those things that we're constrained by in medical centers right now. So with that, I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and thank you for giving me the privilege of visiting and speaking here today.
Thank you. I'd like to invite President Fernie Mundy and Dr. Giovanni Devani to join Dr. Michael Chiang on the panel. Thank you, Michael. This was an incredible overview, not only on all the new exciting developments in ophthalmology, but in medicine at large. You covered a wide range of extremely interesting developments, but you also addressed a lot of the challenges that we face with this new era. So I want to open this panel discussion, by the way, to all of you. I'm not sure, can we receive questions by Zoom, Joanna?
Yes.
We can, okay. So we'll be receiving questions by Zoom as well. And maybe while people get organized with the questions, I'd like to start, Michael. The medical world is changing so much, and you addressed it so elegantly. So, maybe starting sort of from a bigger question, given all these changes in medical research, practice and care that you presented, AI, data science, technology are winning, how do you envision the future medical school of the future to look? And I think this is a very pertinent question, especially here in Maine, as we, one of the very exciting initiatives that I know are sort of in the works is trying to create a medical center and expand on the wonderful work that exists here already. So actually in Maine, there's a great opportunity, especially given the brilliant engineering infrastructure that I've observed here. And some of the thoughts of how could you capitalize on that, and in general, how would the future medical school look like? Not an easy question.
This is a very blue sky question, but let me give a few reactions to that. One of them is that I don't, on the first day of medical school, every student is told that 50% of what they learn over the next 4 years is going to become obsolete by the time they practice, because the field advances so quickly. And on the first day, I never believed that was true, but it turns out it's completely true. And one of the purposes of education that I see is preparing students for understanding what's going to happen with that other 50% that they didn't actually learn. And obviously easier said than done, and I have my own thoughts about that, but I won't bore you with that right now. But I do think that's something that's more true than ever. And just, one of the, I'm amazed, and we talked a little bit last night at dinner about the fact that how many people are really, really good at adapting, and how many people aren't that good at adapting. And, because I'm a 50-something now, I can see people, shift a little bit how people do such a great job, and why I wouldn't necessarily have expected would have 20 years ago. That's one. The other issue is medical care is built around medical education, since that was your question, is built around a model where the patients come to a hospital and they get treated, and the students work in the hospital. It's like, Greg, we were talking about today, that they work in the hospital and they learn from that. One challenge to that is that patients are spending less and less time in hospitals than they ever used to. Okay, what used to be a 2-week hospitalization in the 70s is now a 2-day hospitalization, or sometimes even an outpatient procedure. And I think in some ways the medical education process hasn't fully adapted to that. We still think of education in hospitals. And in a place like Maine, I would take that one step further. That there's a lot more that happens to patients that's not in the doctor's office. Like you go from inpatient to outpatient, outpatient to the patient's home. Like a lot more medical care occurs, medical stuff occurs in the home, than ever occurs at your 15-minute doctor visit once every 6 months. And I think the challenge is, how do we bridge all those gaps, and can we do a better job of capturing education where patients are really living? And so that's what I see as a potential future.
On that one, I just can't hold back from asking an important, another
there's a lot of home monitoring that occurs now, right? Apple Watch. It will tell you these details about what's going on inside, and there are glucose monitors. Just in terms of day-to-day life. And now there are much higher tech medical devices that would be experimental things that someone would bring into a home, and like you do a test at home instead of going to doctors for it. And things like that have enormous promise. And I think in places like Maine that are rural. And I would argue that patients in Washington, D.C. and New York, if they were able to get care from home instead, would love that also. Like they don't want to be spending 3 hours in traffic to go and queuing up in the office either. And so I think that may be an area where there's room for innovation in a place like this, where in the spectrum of need to want, people may be closer to the need in a rural state, but everybody wants those things. And so I do think that that's room for innovation in a generalizable kind of way. And there are many things that would need to be proven. I'm actually not sure there's proof that if somebody monitors their heart rate through their Apple Watch every 15 minutes, that leads to a healthier patient. In theory, it does, because they're exercising more, or getting their VO2 up and their heart rate down. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's leading to a more anxious patient. So I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done on many different levels to prove that telemedicine actually works and doesn't have unintended consequences. But maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. I don't know if it works. Maybe not. Yeah? Is it? I use this one.
So, following up on what you were saying, and also something that you mentioned during your talk, you mentioned like distributed or federated systems. You were referring specifically to data and data centers. But in a sense, what you are describing is kind of a federated approach, in a sense, distributed approach to healthcare, which indeed can be enabled by technology. But then it should be, I think, a shared ownership and responsibility of people. So how much does that translate into a federated, distributed approach in healthcare? So again, thinking about what is it that we could do to get to that place where medical education is important, but what about the social sciences and the social works and nursing? Like, how would an ecosystem look like that can actually support that change?
You know, we've really gotten interested in thinking about this concept of, I'll say science as a team sport, but the premise of what your question was healthcare as a team sport. Completely agree with everything that you said, and everything that I think you're actually getting at, with that. Which is that I think that in a healthcare team, there are many different pieces of that. Doctors, nurses, social workers, physical therapists, you sort of name it, and patients. And since you said patients, I'll do sort of the last in, first out. Patients as partners, I think, is super important. That's the whole premise, obviously, of the Fitbit and the Apple Watch. And how do we best leverage that? Another issue is getting all the different pieces, the so-called caretakers, to actually work together. And another piece of that is that currently, one of the reasons that we don't work together that well is because of competition. If you work in a city like New York City, there are going to be many different healthcare centers that may not necessarily want to federate because they're competing for the same patients. So I think that there are many different issues to try to work out. And I would argue that some of that boils down to the reimbursement models and the incentive models that we have. And so it's kind of rethinking what some of those could look like.
Please.
Can I ask a follow-up question? First of all, fantastic lecture. Thank you so much for it. And so much to think about. But following up on this line of conversation where we talked about healthcare as a team sport, and where you talked about the way medical education was originally built. It's around the concept of patients coming to a hospital and being treated there and interacting with them there. So if you put those two ideas together, and you spoke to some of it in your talk, but I'd like to hear you pull out the 2 or 3 key points that you might recommend concerning the future of medical education. That is to say, these kinds of changes will mean the need to rethink how medical education happens. Any particular directions that you'd like to be sure we consider as we talk about this topic?
President Frimundi, thank you for asking that. I think that one of the issues that we touched on a little bit already is that I think the rate of change of how medicine is practiced, or conducted at least, or the technologies, if I were to break my career into 5-year chunks, the delta for this last 5-year chunk is a lot higher than for any previous chunk that I can really imagine. Even the things that aren't new science, okay, things like genetics, the application to care is going up in a way that we really didn't have before. And I think that gets to the point of giving students the tools to really adapt to what the future looks like. In other words, the opportunity to take in new knowledge. And honestly, I have some concerns that we might not be moving in the correct direction. Education, in a lot of ways, has become more, I don't know what the word is, but I hate to say metrics driven. In other words, can you pass your boards? Can you, well, first of all, can you get a high enough board score to get into medical school? And once you're in medical school, do you pass your board exam? Do you go on And I think somewhere in there there's the potential to lose the ability to actually take in new knowledge. That is not as easy, I think, at least in any way that I've seen to really measure. And that would be one for sure. Number two, we touched on a little bit, understanding how healthcare is actually delivered in the real world and how the medical education system can match that. I know we talked about going from the inpatient to the outpatient. Like decades ago, patients would spend 2 weeks in the hospital for things like heart attacks. And that would mean that students would follow patients every day for 2 weeks to understand the natural progression of that condition. And now, all those things are taking like 2 days, 3 days, and you're out. And people lose the opportunity to follow what really happens over the natural course of disease and treatment. And by the time someone's out, someone new is in, and we're dealing with acute as opposed to chronic. And chronic care is being pushed out to the outpatient setting. And I think that there are some medical schools that are more aggressive than others in incorporating outpatient education, like do a continuity clinic as a student. And in general, by my landscape survey, which isn't totally up to date, but it's not totally out of date, it's a small part of education, the outpatient versus the inpatient. But what's even a smaller part, which is potentially even non-existent, is what happens to the patient and what are they doing when they're not in the hospital and they're not in the doctor's office, because that's 99 point, something in the patient's life that many doctors don't know anything about. And we used this analogy before, that I'm amazed by how many doctors, including myself, don't think about some of these issues until we have parents that are faced with those issues and we see, wow, we didn't really know what was. And so I think that those are all what I consider opportunities. If we were to truly re-envision medical education, gaps that we would try to pick up. And I would say one other thing about this concept of what technologies do and technologies don't do. I've been thinking more and more about what is the actual added value of the human, and how can the human expert best work together with all these technologies, to be the best doctor. And one component, again, is understanding how to leverage the power of the technologies, and the other component is how to do the things that people are going to need, that machines don't do. And in a lot of ways, I would say, if the gap happens to be talking to patients and eliciting concerns and things, I think it would be a little ironic if we had a world where social workers and nurses were better doctors, than doctors, because they're actually good at talking to people and they can get things out of them. And and that would mean, for example, how do we pick the ideal doctor for the 21st century? So many layers of that. So.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Can I ask a question on that? So I've been around the world, well not the world, the U.S. in various doctors' visits, here locally in Bangor, down in Portland, Maine, to Boston, Massachusetts, the Maine clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So I've experienced a lot in the last 6-7 months. So one of the things that has struck me is, one, we kind of are asking doctors to be machines. Like, they are going in and out, like you kept on saying, 15 minutes. So 15 minutes, and I was a person who wanted to go be a doctor and decided to get off that path. And I'm really happy I did, because I feel like you're telling people bad news every 15 minutes, and we're just expecting you to go on with your day. And I don't have that pressure on me, and I'm very thankful that I don't. But how do we incorporate, you want them to be people, but you're not enabling them to be people, because you're expecting them to be machine-like as they're delivering bad news.
I really thank you for sharing those anecdotes. So for those of you who couldn't, let me sort of try to rephrase that question if I can, so everyone can hear it. Medical care is being pushed so that doctors are being asked to do more in less time. And in 15 minutes, how can we expect a doctor to be a machine, deliver all this news, deliver potentially bad news, and then move on to the next person? I think that's a huge challenge. And in a lot of ways, I would argue, if I were to back up a second, that it gets back to that issue of incentives. That if the doctor is incentivized by the number of people they see, I mean, not to be complete, but this is what we get when you do that. And maybe there are different incentives that we could create on a large scale. But getting more to the point of the technology, I hope we can see a world where maybe someday the technologies will help automate some of those things that the doctors are currently feeling like they're forced to do in those 15 minutes. Like, for example, we did some studies, almost 10 years ago, showing that doctors spend about a third of their time, eye doctors, spend about a third of their time with the patients typing into the computer system. And these days, there are pilots with ambient AI scribes that can relieve a little bit of that pressure. And maybe things like that are going to be some of those that can help doctors spend more of their focus in those 15 minutes or whatever it is in the actual doctoring part. And so that's my hope, at least. We're going to have to develop those technologies and prove that they work and that they don't have unintended consequences.
Regarding relying, kind of a follow-up, which was a great question on AI and technology. Some of you might have heard just a couple of days ago was the first robotic surgery, full surgery for cataract that was done in Israel. And I just would love to hear your insight into that, is robotics going to play a major role in surgery, or is there going to be that barrier? Is it a long way if we take into your comments in terms of validity, reproducibility, and so
on? So robotic surgery. A couple of years ago, we had some conversations within DC about this, and I suggested that people look into cataract surgery as a potential for robotic surgery, because it's a situation where if you have a relatively uncomplicated, as far as we can tell, it's in principle you could reproduce that, or so I thought, a few years ago, and we never ended up going further with that. But I love hearing that there's one group that did. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, my guess is that it depends. I think a big part of surgery is, as a surgeon, you have to learn to do the procedure. But the more important part, in my opinion, is that you have to learn what to do when the procedure doesn't go as you anticipate. And some of that is, that's all sort of on the fly. Gosh, this complication occurred, what am I going to do about it? And so I think that's the part that's toughest as a human to learn. Right. And my suspicion is that that's the toughest for a machine to learn, but we have to wait and see.
Wow, this is fantastic. Like that. Well, you have a question from the...
Yes, but...
Okay. And then you can go.
My question has to do with, you talked about using AI to reduce the variability that occurs, interoperability variability. But if you go to Arvo and you see all these AI models, and the labels that they're trained on are the same doctors that you're claiming, not you, but they're claiming are making these errors. So do you think as a field we should move towards incorporating AI, but also with the mechanistic principles that are underlying the physiological processes?
Yeah. Rashad, let me...
Maybe if you can summarize the
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Let me. So the question is basically, and I'll put this a little bit more bluntly than you put it. That if we show data that doctors aren't perfect, and in fact doctors can often show discrepancies, and yet you train AIs based on what the doctors define as the correct answer, how do we know that we're not having garbage in, garbage out? Okay, and the answer is that I think, my answer is that I think that's a huge problem. I think it's a huge problem on multiple levels. One, the most basic level is that if the right answer is a moving target, then how do we know we got the actual right answer? All the evidence that I've seen is that if you get enough experts and give their vote, and with a majority consensus, it will zone in on the closest to the right answer. Now that said, another layer of that is that medicine in 2026 is largely practiced based on underpinnings that came either from basic science or from clinical trials that were done a few decades ago. And because those have been proven to be effective, we teach them to our students, and our students teach them to their students. And I'm not convinced that there's not a better way to do things from real first principles. And I do wonder if AI can help figure out, are there ways that we could be practicing medicine better than state-of-the-art 2026, even where we have treatments, already. And we could talk at great length about some of the mechanistic stuff and some of the other, but maybe I'll just leave it at that. I see that as a future opportunity.
I think we have one question from callers that have joined us on the Zoom.
Oculomics has shown real promise, but still feels ahead of its clinical impact, with models like RetFound performing well in research but not consistently generalizing across patient populations. What level of validation and performance is needed for real-world screening, and what concrete steps can hospital systems with strong data and compute infrastructure take to make that possible?
Oh, this is a super tough question. And so basically, the question, if I can paraphrase it, is we've got...
I was just told it comes from one of my students in Amsterdam.
Okay. Yeah. I think the question is basically, we've got these papers, these published papers that show amazing results. How can we prove that they work on my patients and the ones that I'm going to be seeing? And I don't think our community has an answer to that question yet. I sit on a group, the Office of National Coordinator of Health IT does a lot of AI in the federal government, and heard some presentations about 2 years ago on this exact topic. And there was a group from San Diego and a group from Cornell. And what they both said is that they had developed hospital governance boards that basically took AIs off the shelf, like this RetFound system you mentioned, and evaluated them on their actual population of patients. And they had to be the ones that approved them to work. And now there are many questions that come out of that. If that's going to be the model, what if you're not San Diego or New York City and you don't have that resource to do that? And so that was the closest to the state of the art that I've heard about that.
So just finishing up a family medicine residency cycle, I was shocked to see how much AI dictation and transcription happens in the patient.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good thing, and I think that's also a scary thing based on the garbage in, garbage out principle. How do you see the future of parsing all this AI data? What does the PCP decide what's relevant for the ophthalmologist? How do we make that segue into what's relevant for all the specialists?
Yeah, Kevin, that's a great question. So family medicine rotation, saw some AI-based transcription, and how do we know what is, if the doctor didn't say something for this, if the generalist didn't say something for the specialist, how does the specialist know what they didn't get told? I think that's a great, I mean, as you know, the doctors have this acronym, SOAP, right? Subjective, Objective, Assessment, and Plan. And the subjective is tradition, and this has been around for decades. The subjective, what did my patient tell me? The objective, what did I examine in my patient and find? Assessment and plan, what do I think is happening? And the fact that the O is called objective, I think is telling. Because we've got really, really good data showing that if different people do the same thing to the same patient, they don't get the same answer. In other words, even the O is not as objective as we thought it was like 50, 60 years ago. Not nearly as objective. And to me, that gets at the heart of your question, which is, I've been thinking that the way to approach this, just purely my opinion, is moving closer and closer to the actual raw data of what actually happened that day. It could be the image, it could be the transcript of what actually happened, what the patient really said, not what I said, they said. And that's sort of, if I had to hedge my bets, we may be moving more towards sort of collecting raw and rawer type of data and then feeding that into whatever the next step is, the doctor, the AI. So those are just my thoughts.
I am the timekeeper. So it is 2 p.m. And there are also classes everywhere, so please don't be offended as people have left. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. I've missed you all, and also online. We have several people who were connected from all over the United States and beyond. So for this lecture and session, that was really enlightening. So a big, big thank you, Dr. Chiang. And also I would like to thank Professor Harris, who has been here with us the whole day and has really been an invaluable contributor to how to connect engineering, computing, AI, the education, and ophthalmology. So thank you. And finally, a big thank you to President Perini Mandi, who is hosting this lecture. And it has been really a privilege to explore with all of you today the future of medical research and data science. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.
This wasn't, No. No, thank you for saying that. And